This is a Rattle and Hum Sports podcast for Wednesday, the 12th of June, the year 2013. I'm Bryan Houston, and with us right now talking Dallas Cowboys, as he does all the time for Rattle and Hum Sports, is Matthew Postins. How you doing, Matthew?
I'm fine, Bryan. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you very much. We are into another series of mini camps now with the Dallas Cowboys, and the first order of business is that it seems that Jason Garrett has now finally come to grips with the thought that he is not going to be the play caller. He finally has come out and spoken about it and says he's on the same page with everybody else now, which is quite a bit different than what we thought was the case last week at this time. So what can you tell us?
Well, like you said, he's finally acknowledged publicly that Bill Callahan is going to be calling the plays. And as we talked about last week, I don't think that Garrett really knew what was coming when Jerry Jones revealed that Callahan would be calling the plays this season. So I think it probably just took him a little time to frame how he wanted to frame it publicly, even though, we all know the facts. We all know Jerry's going to make his decision. We all know Jerry basically threw him under the bus last week. So this was just probably Jason's way of rationalizing everything and just trying to put a good face on it publicly. But I find it interesting that they reported during practice today that while Bill Callahan is calling the plays, Wade Wilson is actually the one relaying those plays to the quarterbacks during practice. Now, I don't know if that means anything going into the regular season, but I find that very interesting.
I heard a comedy bit earlier this week on a radio station where basically the process would be that Jerry would be sitting in the press box using flashcards, kind of like semaphore, and then that would get some way that would get over to Callahan in the press box, and then Callahan would make like a long-distance phone call to Wade Wilson, and then they'd run it through Jason, and then probably in about a day and a half you might actually get the play into the huddle.
That's a rather circuitous play-calling tree right there, for sure.
And this is not a team that handles time well to begin with, so I don't think you want to lengthen this process.
I wouldn't think you'd want to either.
Well, with all that being said, though, now that everybody appears to be on the same page, do you see this now being a more efficient situation when it's all said and done? However it came about, is this really going to be the best thing for the Dallas Cowboys, for Jason to hand over the play calling and be able to manage the ball game without having that burden on him?
Well, I think we're going to find out if he really is a good game manager, because there have been questions the last couple of years about how he's managed the game, specifically about right time to call timeouts. He probably mishandled the clock in a few situations, in a few key situations that might have cost the Cowboys a win. I think we're going to find out more about Jason Garrett in that respect this season. But I think it's a misnomer to think he's not going to be involved in the offense. But I think we'll find out really quickly, especially during preseason, what kind of philosophy Bill Callahan's going to bring to play calling. I have to assume he's going to run the football more often, but that's going to be predicated on a great many things in this offense. The good news is there is talent on this team, especially at the skill positions. That's really where the talent is located. So Callahan does have options in how he wants to call plays going into this season. But I envision them running the football more as long as the offensive line gets better and as long as DeMarco Murray stays healthy.
Saw a question on Bleacher Report today that asked, this question was asked, and I'd love to get your take on it. Is Jason Garrett right now the most powerless man in the entire NFL?
It certainly looks like it, doesn't it? I mean, he's not calling plays anymore, which was supposed to be his bread and butter. He really didn't have a whole lot to do with hiring his defensive coordinator. His general manager basically decides when he's going to release information to the world. I firmly believe that Jason Garrett did not get his way during the first round of the draft in April. It certainly does not seem as if Jason Garrett has a whole lot of sway within his organization, which, honestly, if the Cowboys fall flat this year, could actually work in his favor in terms of finding another job, because he could just point to what happened this season and say, look, I had nothing to do with it. It was all Jerry, and it was all Bill Callahan. Give me a job. So it could work in his favor. Who knows?
And yet you see a number of reports out there that the bottom line is if the Cowboys don't make the playoffs, Garrett's a dead man walking.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I know Jerry Jones has said, well, Jason Garrett's got one more year left in his contract, and this is not a coach or walk year in terms of Garrett, but I really cannot imagine if the Cowboys miss the postseason that Jason Garrett comes back in 2014. As much as Jerry Jones wants this to work, I just can't see it happening because that'll be 3.5 years with Jason Garrett as head coach. That'll be 7 years with Jason Garrett as the chief offensive officer on this football team, and they've got 2 playoff berths and 1 playoff win to their credit. I can't really imagine Jerry Jones being able to justify keeping Jason Garrett for 1 more year after that.
Okay, now we move on to our next favorite topic, and that's Tony Romo. The NFL has released another one of those specials listing the top 100 players in the league. Last year, I think he moved from middle of the pack down to the low 90s, and this year he's not in the top 100, it doesn't look like. What do you make of that? He says today that the media just doesn't matter and these polls don't matter, and I'm just curious about your opinion about the perception of Tony Romo by his peers across the board in the NFL.
Well, I always find it interesting that he's usually among the top 100 players in the league in these polls, and yet at the same time he's usually on that list of the 10 most overrated players in the NFL. And you can have it both ways in the NFL, it does appear. You can be a top 100 player, and you can be overrated. I think that some people probably lump Tony Romo into that, when he was coming up as a younger player, the whole trip to Cabo with Jessica Simpson during the playoff bye week. They still look at him as maybe, in some degree, an immature player because he hasn't had a lot of success in the postseason, and yet he gets $108 million for a new 7-year contract over the offseason. So I can certainly see why, if this was a player poll, some folks probably wouldn't vote him in the top 100. And at the end of the day, these polls don't matter because typically the number 1 player in the NFL doesn't play for the team that's either the defending Super Bowl champion or plays for the team that wins the Super Bowl championship. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I think if you're a Cowboys fan, you hope that maybe Tony Romo gets his feelings hurt a little bit and plays with more of a chip on his shoulder this year.
Okay, and in the meantime, he's still not able to practice because of the back injury, the cyst removed, and there's a couple of theories about that the Cowboys need to be more concerned about this than they are letting on. Do you think they are sufficiently concerned about Tony Romo's back?
I think they're concerned enough to keep him out of workouts. Certainly they sit him this week for the mini camp. That means he won't be on the field throwing the football until mid-July when they go to training camp. I saw the Rick Gosselin piece where Gosselin basically says it's time for the Cowboys to be concerned simply because it's a back injury, and there's a certain level of trepidation there anytime you hear anything about a back. I mean, we all saw what happened to Peyton Manning's injury. It went from being a relatively minor back injury to missing an entire season and having 2 of his discs fused. So anytime it's a back injury, you're a little concerned. But if what the Cowboys are saying is accurate and it's just a cyst, I really don't see it being a huge deal. I don't see Tony Romo missing any time during training camp or any time during preseason. And the great thing is he's a veteran player. He doesn't play that much during preseason anyway. He's not going to take a whole lot of reps. He doesn't really need them. So there's plenty of time for him to rest and recover from this surgery. But unless the Cowboys are keeping something from us that we don't know, I'm not really that concerned about it.
The Cowboys apparently are concerned enough with the quarterbacking situation on the whole that they tried to acquire Mike Kafka off waivers. He was a backup for Philadelphia, played very sparingly, but Jacksonville claimed him off waivers. Are the Cowboys, you think, trying to find another veteran quarterback behind Kyle Orton?
It's possible. You look at anytime you see a team put in a waiver claim, I think you have to assess what they have on their roster. And there's no reason to believe they're unhappy with Tony Romo. There's really no reason to believe they're unhappy with Kyle Orton. So I think this is really just a situation where the Cowboys might have been looking to upgrade that number 3 spot. Perhaps Stevens and Williams aren't, really progressing the way they would have hoped during training camp. And, it's that old Jimmy Johnson theory. Churn the bottom of the roster. Try to find guys that are coming off of other teams and really aren't valued very highly and bring them on and see if they can give you something. That might have been what this was. But I don't think this was anything more than maybe trying to find somebody else to throw in the mix at number 3.
All right, and then there is the latest news about Josh Brent, who again violated his probation, tested positive for drugs. Is it time for the Cowboys to just cut bait on him and let him go regardless of the cap hit?
Yes, it is, and it was probably time to let him go after the first violation of his probation about a month ago. But it's obvious that he's not. I hate to criticize a guy for what's happening in his personal life, but when you've had 2 of those sorts of hits when you're on probation in a short period of time, I think that probably tells the Cowboys they probably need to go ahead and cut bait on Josh Brent. I don't think the cap hit's going to be that severe because most of his money isn't guaranteed, but it's probably time to go ahead and let him go because it's obvious he's not going to be back this year. He may not be back in an NFL uniform again. Go ahead and cut him and make your life a little bit easier when it comes time to cut players to go to training camp. It's one less headache to worry about, and it's one more spot to open up.
Okay, another issue now we can talk a little bit about what's going on the field right now. One guy who is blowing everybody away right now is Dez Bryant. We're seeing rave reviews on his performance in these mini camps right now. What do you know, and what can you tell us about that?
Well, when we talked last year, we talked a lot about Dez's year last year, and it's that whole third-year wide receiver theory, that a wide receiver takes a big jump in his third season in the NFL, and Dez Bryant certainly took a big jump. For me, I really wanted to see if he had an off season where he didn't get into trouble, he didn't find his name in the news, he seemed to put his nose down and worked hard and really showed that he had grown up over the course of an off season. And I think he's really shown that this year. We're not hearing about money problems. We're not hearing about family matters. All we're hearing about is that Dez Bryant is working his butt off in camp, that he's beating defensive backs left and right, and that even he publicly has said, I feel like I've kind of grown up now as a person, and I kind of had to go through those things that I went through the first 2 years to get to where I'm at now. He has the talent to be a Calvin Johnson. He has the talent to be a Larry Fitzgerald. The only thing he doesn't have yet is a track record. And, if what we're seeing now carries over into training camp and carries over into the regular season, then I think you're finally going to see the Dez Bryant that I think everybody wanted to see the first year now, which is the guy who's just a beast and just dominating everybody. It was probably a little unrealistic to expect that his first year in the NFL, but it's not unrealistic based on everything we're seeing right now in training camp for him to be one of the dominant receivers in the game in 2013 and beyond.
Okay, and then talking about some of these players who are showing up well in addition to Dez Bryant, who are some of the guys who are really impressing the coaches out there in minicamp right now?
Well, defensively, B.W. Webb, the cornerback out of William & Mary, is getting a lot of positive vibrations from the Cowboys staff, and that's really not a big surprise because he came into this NFL as a 4-year starter at a FCS school at one of the best conferences in FCS, a guy who was a 4-time conference first-team cornerback. The Cowboys may not have drafted a player who was more polished at his position than B.W. Webb. I firmly believe this guy's going to be the number 4 cornerback and may very well push Orlando Scandrick for some time at the number 3 corner. He's come in and he's done some very good work throughout OTAs and heading into minicamp to where I think the Cowboys are beginning to feel comfortable with the fact that Webb could be a guy who could hold his own from day one with wide receivers, especially those number 2 and number 3 guys who don't quite have the elite speed, don't quite have the elite size. I think they really feel as if that he'll be able to handle them once the season rolls around.
Saw, too, where another player, Kyle Wilbur, defensive end, is another guy who's gaining weight, trying to get bigger to play in Monte Kiffin's defense. How's he looking?
So far, so good. This was a guy that they were talking about leaving at linebacker when they moved over to the 4-3 because he, even though he was a little bigger at 245, they felt like he might be able to be a good fit at the outside linebacker position. Well, they changed their mind, decided to move him to defensive end because he played defensive end and a pass-rushing outside linebacker at Wake Forest. They just asked him to do what they've asked of DeMarcus Ware and Anthony Spencer, gain about 10 or 15 more pounds. As long as he can gain that weight without losing the speed that made him such a valued pick for the Cowboys a couple of years ago, I think there's a distinct possibility that he could be a solid backup behind either Ware or Anthony Spencer. And he's one of those guys that the Cowboys really need to hit, because when you really think about it, behind Ware and behind Spencer on the ends, the only really proven guy they have is Anthony Hargrove. And really, he's just going to be more of a run-stopping defensive end. They need a couple of guys during this process leading up to the regular season to really bubble up to the top and show they can be, competent, even above average depth at the end position. And if Wilbur can show that, that's going to make things a little bit easier for the Cowboys when it comes to how they're going to set up their rotations in the defensive end position. There's another guy, Tyrone Crawford, who very well could fit into that mix as well.
How have the players adjusted to Monte Kiffin's defense so far? I know we talked about this some last week, but in reading different articles today, it seems like the players really like the idea of a simplified defense, one where they don't have to think quite so much.
Yeah, and that's one of the real charms of the cover two. It's a very basic formation. You can do a lot of different things in it, but really at the core, the defensive line has one job: penetrate the line of scrimmage. The linebackers have really one job: cover the spaces in the medium field, whether it's the run or the pass. The defensive backs really have one job, and that's just cover your area on the field. Whatever receiver, running back, or tight end comes in your direction in the field, that's the guy you cover. It's a very simple offense, and when it's executed properly, as we saw in Tampa Bay, you can really devastate teams from a defensive standpoint in terms of the amount of points you give up, in terms of the yardage you give up, and in terms of the turnovers that you create. And really for the Cowboys, that's the last part. That's the big piece they need. They need to create more turnovers defensively. They weren't able to do it last year, even though they were supposed to be playing in an aggressive 3-4 scheme under Rob Ryan. They really didn't create a lot of turnovers. That's something that has to change this year. And by giving them a simplified scheme and a simplified framework to work in, that, believe it or not, actually gives you a little more freedom as a player to, freelance within the system, put yourself in positions where you can create turnovers, and in doing so, you're going to give your offense more opportunities to score points.
Another thing about the cover two, the Monte Kiffin defense, is you got to have a big hitting safety, and apparently Will Allen, the new Cowboy safety, is making an impression in camp so far.
That's not surprising. Will played in that system at Tampa Bay under Monte Kiffin. He was a guy that Monte actually had a hand in drafting several years ago when Will Allen came into the league. So not a big surprise that Will's been able to come in and give the Cowboys, an experienced guy who understands the formation, who understands what it takes to be successful, and has put himself in a position where he can start this year. And I think what Will Allen is doing is really helping Matt Johnson, the safety that the Cowboys really want to be a serious contributor to their defense this year. This is a guy they drafted out of Eastern Washington, a guy that they really felt like was an undervalued gem in the rough kind of pick. And he didn't play at all last year because he was hurt. Well, Johnson's healthy now. He's really impressed coaches in the camp with his ability to stop the run and the pass, with his ability to hit. And I think with Will Allen there,
trying to get back by July and be ready for camp, is he a factor at all in the receiving corps?
I think it's going to be very difficult for him to be a factor in the receiving corps. Danny was a guy they liked last year when they drafted him in the 5th round, but like Matt Johnson, he had injury problems throughout OTAs and training camp. He was basically on the practice squad the whole year. He really didn't get an opportunity to show himself. And while that was happening, you saw a guy like Dwayne Harris emerge. You saw Cole Beasley make a name for himself in the offense. Now you have Terrence Williams, the 3rd-round pick, who is going to make the roster as long as he's not hurt. So really, when you think about it, the Cowboys will probably keep 6 wide receivers. Well, you got Dez Bryant, you got Miles Austin, you got Terrence Williams, you've got Dwayne Harris, you've got Cole Beasley, you've got Anthony Armstrong, the veteran who used to be in Washington. You've really got a whole bunch of guys competing for 1, maybe 2 spots on this roster. Unless Cole has a tremendous training camp and a tremendous preseason, I don't see him making the roster, although the Cowboys still have the option of allowing him to be put on the practice squad for another year, so they could still control his rights for another year. You can keep a player on the practice squad who's never played in the NFL for up to 3 years. So right now, based on what I'm seeing in camp and based on Cole's situation, I see him as more of a practice squad guy if the Cowboys want to keep him another year than a guy who right now is a legitimate contender to take one of those 6 roster spots at wide receiver.
Okay, and last but not least, talking about the 2 biggest concern areas on these Cowboys all year long, offensive line and the interior defensive line. Is there anything that we can see in these mini camps right now that shows us that they're going to be significantly better on either side of the ball, tackle to tackle?
Well, the Cowboys say all the right things, and that they're very happy with how they're progressing, both offensively and defensively. But we're not really going to get a very clear indication for how well these 2 particular position groups are playing together until we get into the preseason. I mean, certainly Travis Frederick has had a very nice showing so far in OTAs and training camp. It sounds like Phil Costa's played well. It sounds like Ratliff and Hatcher have come along in the cover 2 system nicely in the inside position, but we're not going to have a clear indication until we get well into preseason as to whether these guys have really taken to the system and really taken to playing together. But let's be perfectly honest. If the offensive line and the defensive line play better than they did last year, this will be a better football team. If they play about the way they played last year, I don't see much changing, because the Cowboys have to run the football better, which means their offensive line has to play better. The Cowboys have to get behind the line of scrimmage more often, which means Hatcher and Ratliff and whoever's backing them up has to get more push in the interior defensive line. These 2 groups, it really matters how well they play. How well they play dictates how well the Cowboys play as a team this whole season, in my opinion.
Fundamental football, it's what is up front that counts. All right, so what's coming up on Rattle and Hum Sports as far as you're concerned for the next week?
Well, we'll be wrapping up minicamp. Minicamp is going to wrap up tomorrow with Thursday, and that will be the last the Cowboys and the players will see of one another until we go to training camp in Oxnard in July. So a lot of what we'll be doing over the next few weeks is wrapping up minicamp, kind of assessing where the roster's at, and kind of getting things geared up for training camp in terms of who are the really important players, the guys who really have to step up to help this team be successful, which players are on the bubble, which position groups are in good shape, which position groups need help. I think we can all figure out which position groups those are. Based on what we've talked about the last 4 months. So it's really going to be all about getting geared up for training camp. This is actually the one time of the year when a guy who covers the NFL can actually get a little time off. So hopefully I'll get to relax a little bit for a couple of days before we go to training camp.
Well, I hope so. And I'm sorry that I didn't have a chance to get you to weigh in on Tim Tebow like everybody else in the world has. I mean, feel free if you'd like to add something to that right now.
You know what? I don't think there is a better place for Tim Tebow right now than New England. If somebody can figure out how to use this guy effectively within the skill set that he has now, it's Bill Belichick. I mean, even if Tim Tebow just plays 5-10 plays a game, Belichick will find a way to get him involved and get him successful. Don't think about Tebow in Denver. Think about Tebow in Florida playing behind Chris Leak and the kind of things that Urban Meyer did with him. Mm-hmm. Using him as a shotgun quarterback, using him as an H-back, using him as a tight end. Those are the kinds of things that I think Bill Belichick will do with Tim Tebow this season. And the great thing about Tebow is, he's got a believer in him in Josh McDaniels. He doesn't have to be the guy. He doesn't have to be successful right now. He can sit behind Tom Brady for 3 or 4 years, learn the craft of being an NFL quarterback, and then when Brady finally retires, if Tim Tebow has figured out how to consistently hit a receiver 60% of the time, there might be a place for him in the NFL as a starting quarterback.
There you've had a chance to weigh in, and I appreciate that. Matthew, great talking to you as always. We look forward to reading your stuff in Rattle and Hum Sports, and we'll be talking to you next time, okay?
Thanks, Brian.
All right, that's Dallas Cowboys beat writer Matthew Postins covering the Cowboys for Rattle and Hum Sports. This is a Rattle and Hum Sports podcast. I'm Bryan Houston. Thanks very much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.